We have executives who will have one conversation with their brother-in-law and come back and say, wow, they said this and we've got to run with it. It's like, can we just get a little more disciplined about not your brother-in-law conversation? Can we just ask 10 people who fit our target demographic? Because the space has been so brainwashed by the technology vendors to think that, no. Why would you ask 10 people something when you could look at what 10,000 people did? Isn't looking at what 10,000 people did just definitionally better? It's like, well, not if it's a question about their attitudes or their beliefs.
Welcome to Any Insights Yet? The podcast that explores the intersection of strategy, inspiration, and branding. I'm Chris Kochek. In today's episode, we're joined by Tim Wilson and Valerie Kroll from Facts and Feelings, an intelligent business consultancy which takes a very different approach to uncovering insights. In an era of big data, Tim and Val are obsessed with less and better. And over the years, they've helped a wide variety of brands get to better places, including Yoplait, Time Warner, P&G, Purell, Lysol, and more. What I love about their approach is the way they assume data doesn't always have the answers. They treat data less like a crystal ball and more like a conversation starter. Now, don't get me wrong, they know how to slice and dice data like a samurai warrior 6 ways from Sunday. But they also recognize there are plenty of times where, instead of rushing to interrogate the data, you might be better off just talking to someone. So whether you're swimming in dashboards or knee-deep in focus groups, I promise you this conversation will give you a new roadmap for turning raw information into more powerful insights. Let's get into it. Val, when we were talking the other day and you said data isn't the truth, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple things to unpack with that. One is that there's this really common misconception that if you just try hard enough to put your hands on that exact right piece of clean data with the right filters applied, that's going to tell you what to do. And that's just not true, right? And first of all, that's like an exhausting hamster wheel to be on, always like looking for that perfect clean piece of data. But we all know the saying about, you can torture data to say anything that you want it to say. But more importantly, that data needs to be analyzed and interpreted to inform those decisions, and that there needs to be collaboration between the person who's writing the SQL queries or diving into the data and the person who needs to make that decision. And that collaboration is what is going to provide that action. And that's way more important than it being true or perfect, right?
Mm-hmm. Do any examples come to mind where you had a data point and then you tortured it or interrogated it and you realized it was trying to mislead you?
Well, I think a lot of times the clients that we work with, there's certain things that are just really uncomfortable when they are true. So when you share some of those initial findings or results or, validation activities, they say, but what if we looked at just new visitors? Or what if we cut that by people who visited on these types of devices or whatever, like looking for some subsegment where there is something that is more convenient with the direction that they're already on or the path that they've already taken or what leadership has already decided, because it's so much extra work, or you're kind of swimming upstream or trying to turn around the Titanic if those things were real. And so I would say that those situations are much more common because it's uncomfortable sometimes to be able to find the action in what you found.
When I've worked inside creative agencies or when I've been kind of more of a analytics consultant for a large brand, like at a large CPG brand, there's just so much money pouring into the display advertising or social media advertising. And then it would be like, we spent $1 million on this. Can you pull the data and tell us how it did? The real question is, can you pull the data and tell us why this was successful? The number of times I've had a circular discussion around what is it you actually think is going on? Like, how do you think this is working? Because it's completely divorced from your experience as a human being, but you're coming and asking for the data to somehow show some sort of hard metric that shows that this worked. And it is one that's like, we'll keep slicing it. What if we only looked at the visitors who came in this way? What if we only looked at mobile? I used to see that all the time where you'd watch some self-optimizing campaign steer itself towards mobile mobile ads, and it was like, oh, this is steering towards this because this is where the bots are the worst and accidental clicks work. That traffic does nothing, but man, they got a low cost per impression. And they'd want to report that. They'd say, look, we delivered impressions cheaply. We grew awareness. So,
right. So they're using the data the way a drunk uses a lamppost for support, not for illumination.
Yeah.
It's severe inebriation, and they're just trying to keep themselves held up. So you have to speak truth to power then in those situations, right? Or do you just let it slide? Or do you say, guys, I want to point out the data is actually telling us this. Tim, what have you done in those moments?
What doesn't work is saying, well, no, you're wrong. The data's not good. Like I have had analysts work for me. I have worked with analysts who kind of want to walk around and kind of wield the data like a cudgel and say, no, you're wrong. Like you're stupid. And while there may be some factual accuracy to that, it's super misguided. Like we've got to meet people where they are and have a conversation about, let's talk about what we really think is going on. Let's provide the data, but it never serves anyone well to make someone look stupid or feel stupid. So recognizing that people have beliefs, they have things they want to be true, helping them tease out how they could get more confidence in that so that then they're a partner when you look at the data and say, well, the data doesn't actually support that. So let's adjust our beliefs together, but it shifts it much, much more to the communication and the collaboration and the alignment. It has never worked to say you're wrong. The data says X. Like that's just, humans don't work that way.
So what's a turn of phrase that either of you guys use that is in place of a softer version of you're wrong? How do you jujitsu the conversation to a place where it's going to be more effective for everyone involved?
So I'll tell you one that I actually used on a call just yesterday where we were coaching a client in a similar spirit. It's like, let's be kinder to our future selves because it's inconvenient now, but you know what would be worse is if everyone made a decision based on this like tortured version of the truth of the data. And then down the line, there's negative business impact, or you have to walk this back, or you have to explain why we didn't see the intended expected uplift in the P&L, right? So like, let's not be quick in the moment about what will be easy to move on to the next thing. And instead, let's think about like what that broader, bigger story is, or how we could use the data to help invest in a pivot or to figure out what we could be doing next instead. And so the being kinder to your future self is one that we've used because it's like, it also makes it less about that person and more about like the realities of the business. And no one wants to walk into their boss's office and say, we made a bad call. Now we have a lot of undoing to prioritize instead of the things that we were hoping to be doing in this quarter. So that's one that we've gotten some traction on.
What happens a lot is it is after the fact. Hey, can you look at the data and do X? And lots of analysts will say, no, I need to be in the upfront in the planning. And so the way I tend to think about it is there's a degree of meeting them where they are and saying, okay, if this is the data that you want, what I'm going to ask back from you is, what does success look like? What are our ideas? What hypotheses are we trying out? And make sure that we are being kind to our future selves, because now when we're going through the actual execution of the campaign, one, we may do it in a different way so that we actually can learn from it. And we have objectively agreed, well, emotions are not as involved when we're planning. The phrase I use is we're never more objective about what we might achieve than before we set out to achieve it. So just recognizing that it's breaking a cycle of saying we can't show up for the weekly report or the monthly report and have it now tell me how things did and what the insights were and spend the entire time talking about what's happened. That should be a little bit of the conversation. Those cycles need to be, now what are we going to do next? And what do we expect that we can learn, or what do we think will be successful? What does success look like going forward? So that's a companion to the be kind to our future selves. I mean, we have to think about our future selves and talk about our future selves.
And this ties in with something that we also talked about previously, which was the pre-mortem. You want to talk a little bit about your approach with the pre-mortem instead of the post-mortem?
You want to do that, Val, or you want me to?
let's both do it. So the postmortem activity is after the fact, what happened? How did we get here? Kind of looking diagnostically, looking for potential root causes. A premortem is kind of anticipating some of those actions and activities. And so instead of saying like, okay, here's the goals, here are the outcomes we're trying to achieve this year, what are all the things we're going to do to achieve those goals? Let's pause first and think about any of the friction along the way. What are the things that are going to keep us from achieving those goals, and kind of filling in the blank to say, we failed to reach this goal because sometimes shakes things loose, we notice in conversations a little bit differently than if we were just focused on all the things that we could list out that we're going to do to achieve those goals. And so that pre-mortem activity is very much a sister to the concept that Tim was talking about how do we be as objective as possible before we start launching into all those activities so that we can be more thoughtful and creative in how we think about overcoming the friction or obstacles over the course of the year, whatever the time period is.
I think the first time that I had a pre-mortem kind of explicitly explained, it was in it might have been Annie Duke's first book, where she talks so much about decision making and saying we get a lot more concerned about losing stuff than we do about gaining stuff. And so it's a useful thought exercise to say, imagine your future self where you've lost something, and that kind of like wakes the brain up a little bit to say, I don't want to feel that. So let me think about what could cause me to feel that. And it does kind of surface ideas, which has nothing to do with the data or the analytics, but it surfaces some really rich ideas that then data can be applied to try to head off those problems.
So at the beginning of a project, you like to ask, what's going to bring a smile to your face at the end of this? And what's going to make you cry a little bit at night?
When trying to set a target for a KPI, when somebody says, I don't know what success looks like, I've never done this before, you're asking me to set a target for a metric that I've never used. I don't know what that should be. And Val will slip in this, like, imagine your future self, and you're going to be reporting out that metric. Like, what would you be happy to report out? Once you get that nailed down, then the question is like, okay, you don't have a smile on your face. You missed it. What went wrong? Which then shifts a little bit more into really thinking about the brand or the campaign or the initiative or the project and kind of putting a little doom and gloom on. So I don't know that we thought of them kind of as companions like that before, but you just surfaced that as a way to think about it. Thanks, Chris.
That's what happens in conversations. Sometimes you can talk about the same thing multiple times, but with each iteration, something else kind of comes up, or somebody says something and twists it a little bit, and you kind of get a new perspective. And by the way, I love that you guys are called Facts and Feelings, that your agency is called Facts and Feelings. Can you talk briefly a little bit more about that? What was the idea behind that name?
So one, we would call ourselves a consultancy, not an agency, but there's definitely no trauma that is forcing me to make that disclaimer. The surface level, the way that gets interpreted is like facts and feelings is like quant and qual. And we think of it much more as there has been a gross over-indexing to hard data. It kind of gets back to even what Val was talking about, that, people think they're going to get to the truth. And that winds up giving a lot of organizations and a lot of people within organizations an out to not think hard, to not have like good, hard, creative thought. So when we say facts and feelings, the facts are, yes, there's data, there's research, there's experimentation, there's analytics, and those are well tried and true techniques. But we want to bring to kind of parity the human creativity. Let's not undervalue gut instinct. Do you take somebody who's been working in this space, some space for 20 years, and they say, I just sort of feel like this could be going on? I don't want to discount that. I want to interrogate that. Tell me more. How much confidence do they have in that? And now how can we go about validating that idea or failing to validate it? I mean, it loosely kind of has a quant and qual component to it, but really the feelings is much more about raising up the value of the marketer, the brand manager, and just what their thoughts and ideas are, and not trying to shove that to the side or letting them shove it to the side and say, no, the data should just tell me the questions and the answers and what I should do.
Yeah, there's something to be said for instinct. Instinct is operating on a speed that's just faster than what the naked eye can see sometimes.
Which drives me a little nuts with AI when people think the AI is going to, I think generative AI, great ideation companion, but I'm like, there's something to the human brain that is kind of magical. And damn it, like we need to not think that the goal is to replace that. Like that's just bonkers.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you said you don't like to think about it as quant and qual, but Tim, you have a strong quant background, right? And Val, you have a pretty strong qual background, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd say a good mix. Yeah.
Val's probably more balanced than I am.
Is there an example of a project where you guys have worked together on things where, some qualitative research and some quantitative research came together in beautiful harmony and birthed some very interesting aha moments, some twins, some triplets, things like that?
The 1 + 1 = 4. Well, so I was working in market research in 2009, if we can think all the way back to the swine flu outbreak, which feels so weird to think about in like air quotes post-pandemic COVID terms, but Lysol was a client and they really wanted to act quickly and jump on top of something. And their early stage concept was this like chunky bracelet that had wipes in it that you could pull out to clean surfaces. And they wanted to jump straight into the concepts to understand what is the messaging, what is the price point, like how many wipes should fit inside of the bracelet. And we kind of recommended like, what if we started with some qual first to just kind of like understand this? Like we've never dealt with swine flu outbreak before. Like let's understand this a little bit more before we dive in. So we did some qual research. It was a new methodology at the time. It was called Twitter slicing, which, quick aside, was invented by Kelly Styring, who wrote a book. It's called In Your Purse, The Archaeology of the American Handbag. But I looked and the company that she worked for at the time was called Insight Farm. And I was like, I think Chris and Tim would appreciate that one.
I'm going to get that book.
It's super interesting. Anyway, so she developed this methodology, like, again, 2009. It wasn't as easy to think about like, oh, like user testing, download an app. And that's the way you're going to be in contact with your researchers. So we had these like scheduled DMs that went out like 5 or 6 times a day that asked 2 questions inside of 140 characters that said, where are you and what are your current health and safety concerns? And one of the things that came out of the qual research is that there was actually nothing about the surfaces around people that caused concern. It was, I wish I had an opportunity to wash my hands, or it was all about airborne stuff. And so we ended up canceling the quant because Lysol was like, people probably aren't going to be down for a chunky bracelet that's going to help them clean surfaces if that's like not what the primary concern is. However, what I do think is really interesting is at the same time, Lysol was owned by the same parent company as Purell. And they took this insight to help create those silicone holders for those small hand sanitizers so that you could take hand sanitizer on the road. So that was how they used some of this research to make sure that people could keep their hands clean, because Purell had more equity in the hand sanitizing space than Lysol, which was more about surfaces. So that was one of the times where there was like, we got to go fast, launch this quant study. What are the concepts? And it was actually like, let's pause. Let's explore, let's learn. And that actually probably saved Lysol from what would be a laughable product launch and probably quickly cancellation from the market. So
chunky bracelets
of wipes.
So how many people did you send these DMs to under 140 characters to get back enough data that Lysol was like, you know what, you're right, we're going to give a pause on this?
So in qual research, you usually don't need respondents or base sizes as large as quantitative studies because you start to notice like patterns and repetitions. And so I think it was like under 50 people. I think like 30 to 50 is like pretty common if it's this type of qualitative research, but there was a couple subsegments. We wanted to make sure that there was people who were head of household, who had purchasing power and decisions, but we also wanted to capture some of the younger segments as well. So I think it was like sub 50 people, and it was just kind of those open ends that were leveraged for those.
So the innovation went from a chunky bracelet to a silicone holder for the Purell.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. Tim, do you have any stories that come to your mind?
I mean, they're not nearly as fun as that. Most of my stories are more, they come in where they're looking for something in the quant and I'm like, could we do some qual? And one that comes to mind is like marketplace type sites where they've got like a recruiting site where you've got job seekers and leads for companies. But there was like a home healthcare brand that had that. They had people who were potential employees, franchise model, who were looking to be home health aides. And then they had people who were coming in who generally was a family member who needed home health support. And so they had that basic understanding that, oh, we've got two reasons people are coming to the site. They're either looking for services for a loved one or they're looking for a job, they're job seekers. And they were looking at some of the job seeker data. They were saying we can figure out which one they are based on what they do. And stuff wasn't making sense with some of the ones that looked like they were looking for services because they were trying to just kind of suss it out from their behavior. And we ultimately said, can we just ask people why they're coming to the site and just confirm? Because we have in our mind that we understand like these two big personas. And what they found, and this was a simple little pop-up survey, was, oh, there are people who are current employees, they're assigned somewhere, they just have like questions about their paycheck or their benefits or how it's going to get paid. They're coming in to go track down their whichever franchisee they're actually working for. That's the fastest path for them to come through. And by the way, we're not making it very easy for them, which makes all of a sudden these people who are workers actually look like they are looking for services because they're just trying to find the right phone number. So that led to some kind of useful site information architecture kind of questions or ways to answer that needed to happen. So not nearly as fun, but the marketplace sites are always where you've got at a minimum two fundamentally different types of users, and asking them rather than trying to suss out, what does Google Analytics tell me? What do they want? What are they looking for? And I'm like, anytime somebody says, what do they want? I'm like, you're asking me to look at their behaviors and make a bunch of inferences about, something attitudinal. So I think more often than not, I've been like, it is cheap and easy to ask them. And we don't have to ask them forever. We can ask them for a couple of weeks. And to Val's point, you don't need a whole lot of data that all of a sudden it seems like light bulbs go on like, oh, this totally makes sense now that's what there's a population coming for that purpose.
Well, you say it's not as fun, but I'm a nerd, so I find it completely fascinating because what I picked up out of that is that something about the data is not making sense. So let's dig into it. Right? Let's find out what's going on. And I love this idea of like, well, you could spend this much time reading the tea leaves of the data, or you could just go ask people. Now, of course, there are challenges to asking people. Sometimes they won't always tell you the truth, or they'll tell you little white lies that are not quite true. But in this case, people came forward and said, yeah, I'm an employee. I'm trying to, get access to this part of the website. So I think the big takeaway for me there is when your data is not making sense, pause for a second and ask what's really going on here. Is there a faster, cheaper way for us to get an answer than poring over the data like a bunch of soothsayers?
I mean, it is. Wait, can you run a fancier model? Could you do a cluster analysis on that? And the number of times, again, I understand the human nature that industry is so baked into all we have to do is gather and integrate and clean all the data, and then like insights will emerge. But the whole reason that controlled experimentation exists is because that's where scientific evidence comes from. And we have executives who will have one conversation with their brother-in-law and come back and say, wow, they said this and we've got to run with it. It's like, can we just get a little more disciplined about not your brother-in-law conversation? Can we just ask 10 people who fit our target demographic? Because the space has been so brainwashed by the technology vendors to think that, no, why would you ask 10 people something when you could look at what 10,000 people did? Isn't looking at what 10,000 people did just definitionally better? It's like, well, not if it's a question about their attitudes or their beliefs. Like you're trying to read the tea leaves when you could just, I don't know, take a drink.
Yep.
What I would say on the inverse too, though, because I made this transition from like market research into digital analytics. And I always felt like on the market research side, I was always asking someone about like their intent. Like, what is your intent to purchase again? Or like, if it was an alcohol, like the frequency in which you're going to purchase it, or go on a cruise again in the next year. But we never knew like, how true was that, and how people want to share the information that the researcher is trying to seek at times, especially in qualitative when it's face to face. And so I felt like, I just need to lean into more quantitative so I know what people actually do. But what I found in this transition, I was like, there's this like perfect marriage of like these two concepts together and making sure you're relying on the right methodology for the question that's at hand, which is, I think, a little bit what you were getting to, Chris. Like, let's pause and think if there's another way that we can get at this information, again, for best fit against the risk the business is taking with this next decision, because it's not always the one single methodology. Tim loves to use for this specific concept that comes up quite a bit is the analyst who's holding the hammer thinks that everything looks like a nail. But really, if we get more diverse in thinking about the different methodologies and fitting them as appropriate, we'll end up getting what we're looking for quicker, faster, cheaper, hopefully more robust.
And I've often found that qualitative, if you do it really, really well, directionally, even though like you may only have 10 people, 12 people, 20 people, when you go do the quant afterward, first of all, it informs the quant to help you in the quant side. But then directionally, a lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times, the quant will be like, yep, you had it. You had it at the qual part, right? Like the findings were right in the qual, but a lot of times with clients, you have to have that statistical significance because they're going to bet a lot of money on a particular effort.
But that's getting to a key thing. If there's an aha, and I can think of the account managers at the agency coming back from actually watching, why am I blanking on what asking
focus
a focus group?
A
Yeah,
focus
there we go.
group?
Woo, boy.
We'll fix that in post.
Yeah. They're like, that was amazing. And then the question is like, okay, did we hear something that surprised us? But then when we thought about it, it makes so much sense that we're ready right now to go bet whatever we're going to bet. It's still definitionally still anecdotal evidence, even if it's a really well-run focus group with 10 or 15 people, or maybe it's 3 focus groups. Starting to see a pattern. What is the risk of running with that? And that's a combination of how strong was the signal from that limited group and how much does this really line up with kind of as we think about it? Maybe that's good enough. Or is this like, no, this is like a fundamental pivot that we're going to make. We're going to fundamentally overhaul how we do something. We should probably do this in a way that we can actually then validate that this really holds up and translates to, actual behavior. But all of that is about like human judgment of like, what's the trade-offs? How strong is the evidence that we need? Because the stronger the evidence we want, the more expensive, the more time it takes. And that should be 1,000% driven by what are the stakes? Like, how important is this bet? How many chips are we putting on the table?
But a lot of people are nervous inside organizations, right? Their bonuses are tied to various things. The incentives are structured in such a way that, going back to what we were saying earlier, hey, show me the data that proves the point that we want to be proved, right?
But it can also go to, well, we heard this in the qualitative, and we're going to extrapolate that to a theory. If that theory holds up, then that means in the quantitative data, we would expect to see X. And if we see X, then we're going to do Y. And if we don't see X, well, then we've got a conundrum and we need to do more thinking. And maybe the best bet is to, not take action. What kills me is how much like that is all kind of structured thinking and getting multiple people to have that kind of discussion in the debate. Because I think a lot of risking gets removed if everyone's talked about it and said, here's our decision-making pattern. And if we make a decision and the result is not great, I mean, another nod to Annie Duke, like the concept of resulting. If you make the best decision you can with the information you have at hand and it doesn't work out, it doesn't mean it was a bad decision. Like you still could have made the best decision with the information that you had. But one way to kind of de-risk that is to get everyone agreeing that based on the information we have and the way we're going to make this decision and how we're going to check whether it worked out or not and walk away, by the time it actually hits, it's kind of boring when the quant hits and says, yep, it worked. And everybody says, well, yeah, that's what we expected. Or nope, it didn't work. And you'd say, yeah, we thought that might happen. Now we're going to stop. It becomes less sexy, but actually more useful.
I remember there was, and this was work that someone alongside me did back in the day for a large beverage distributor, but there was a lot of kind of meta analysis done to kind of look back to say, of the launches that we've done, which ones were the most successful and what did the research leading up to it say, to kind of figure out what are the right methodologies to help us be more predictive. I'm not going to say predictive analysis, but more predictive of actual successes. And it was funny that when they did quantitative research to have like pick lists of like, which beers do you wish were available in your area? People are like, oh yeah, like that one sounds like a fun name. Or I've heard people talk about it. I've seen that on social media. I'm excited about it, but it wasn't indicative of behaviors. Or if they would pull people into a focus group and they would give like taste tests, like, do you like this? Yes, no. It would be like, okay, is that successful? Is that going to mean a good launch? And it wasn't. And so they developed this really intense hybrid methodology that was super expensive, but actually qualitative, where they would rent out a bar in these like local areas and they would recruit participants and have them bring 5 of their friends. And they had beer glasses and they had sensors on the bottom to pick up and understand how much volume is still in the glass and how many times it was tipped back for someone to take a sip. And so half the tables were offered the beer that they were testing and half of them were offered like the house beer, the most popular one. And there was like appetizers that were chosen that weren't too spicy, but like were the things that people would drink alongside these beers, to say how often did the people who tested the test beer order it a second time versus be willing to try the new beer that was like listed on the menu. They like faked out the menus and it was all this. And that was actually what was most predictive of a successful launch, because there's so many things to control for. Like, so this researcher had to make sure that the beer was at the proper temperature. Like if you were to go to London, you're not going to have a crisp, cool Coors Light temperature beer, right? So there was like so much to think about in the context of how it was going to be consumed. And it was like worth it to pay for like 3 of those to decide if a beer would get launched in certain geographies and markets. And I like loved that was the methodology that was like the proven tried and true method over time that they arrived at. So.
And 10 years later, they followed up with those study subjects and they said, yes, they were the luckiest people in the world. They lived better lives for having stumbled across that as a secondary source of income in their college days.
Right.
I wish I could have been involved in that research project. I'm still wrapping my head around sensors on beer glasses to measure how many times it was lifted and tipped.
It was super tiny. It was like a little sticker. It was super tiny. So it was like not obtrusive. So it was pretty cool.
This is Mission Impossible level research. I love both quant and qual, but one of the things I love about qual is sometimes you can get ideas in what isn't said, right? People will tell you things and you've got to read between the lines. And also you've got to kind of pay attention to the pregnant pause or realize that there's something that was left unspoken and then maybe give voice to it. You had a situation with Yoplait where something came up in focus groups. Did you remember the question that led to the moment that eventually led to the new product idea?
So I love the way you asked that question, because it was actually not a question that was in the research that allowed us to help our client arrive at this conclusion. So this is again back in like the mid 2010s. And so at the time there's like all these like crazy flavors and colors to get people to buy the yogurt for kids. It was very much that target audience. So it's moms in a lot of cases buying for their kiddos. And so they were trying to figure out like, how do we sell more? Because, you know, the opportunity cost is really easy to switch between brands. It's like what I buy one Sunday could be very different the next Sunday if that's what's on sale or that's what's on the top shelf. So they were trying to find something that was like a little bit more sticky to kind of create some brand loyalty. So those all these levers that they were trying to explore. We had this whole discussion guide of things that we were planning to ask to try to figure out what was going to influence more of these behaviors. But one of the questions that we were exploring at the very tail end of some of these, after we had talked about and discussed some of the concepts, is what holds you back from packing a yogurt in your kid's lunch in the first place? And mom would say like, well, I would put a yogurt in my kid's lunch every day if I knew those spoons were going to come back. And they like kind of all laughed. And then it was like, oh, we should ask that in like the next group to kind of see if that's something. And it ended up being like one of the key themes. It wasn't even one of the intended things we wanted to explore with the research, but the spoon not coming home was something that their R&D team really jumped on. And that was some of the inspiration for Go-Gurt, which is the spoonless way to consume fun colored and flavored yogurts at the time. So it wasn't one of the concepts that was even presented or one of the areas that they're considering exploring or licensing for logos or characters to be on the yogurt. It was moms have hesitation in the amount of volume they're willing to pack in a lunch because the spoons don't come home.
Well, I can testify my kids, when they were younger, we, wanted them to have yogurt, and the form factor was very, very important. It wasn't even with packing lunches, right? There was almost like a lunchable component to it where it was like, I get to control the yogurt in this way that's different. And so like they like to eat it out of the tube as opposed to eating it with a spoon, which perhaps is, more grown up or something. They just felt like they had more power and control and got them to eat yogurt that way. So the form factor can really affect consumption.
Yeah, for sure. I like that.
Tim, do you have any favorite questions that you like to ask when you are getting started on a project?
When working with a client, I kind of cheekily call these the two magic questions, and they literally are like, what are you trying to achieve? And how will you know if you've done that? So getting people talking on that front, which can be a little odd because there are so many preconceptions, like, oh, the analyst is going to come in and they're going to ask me like, which of these 27 metrics do I care about the most? And again, I've watched analysts, and I guess it was me early on saying, what data do you want to look at? And so it's more that I want to ask a lot more understanding the business and the ideas, very kind of qualitative type questions. And eventually then I'll get to, well, what do you look at now that's useful? Like, what is something that was useful? What is not useful? A lot of times I'm coming into a client and pretty much I'm looking for evidence that they are awash with data and reports that are not really serving any purpose. But I don't want to come in and tell them that. I want to hear it from them first.
Well, let's do a little role playing for a second. I'm going to pretend to be a client and you guys are going to be the consultants. Okay. All right. Didn't plan on doing this, but I thought this could be fun just now since you said, I like to ask what's keeping you up at night. Okay. So I'm the client and I'm going to say sales. We just got to get more sales. That's what's keeping me up at night. Next question. Go ahead. Go ahead. Hit me with your next question. Val, you guys can tag team it.
So tell me a little bit more about like sales. Is it volume? Is it revenue? Is it profitability? Is it specific product lines? You say sales. Can you dig in a little bit more and help me understand what you mean by sales? What do you know is problematic about sales?
Yeah, revenue's going down. Revenue's going down year over year. And I want to make that revenue go up.
So you actually have had negative growth. It's not even that you're not hitting the target, the growth targets that you set. It sounds like you're saying it's literally declining.
Yep. Year over year, sales are down.
Is the market shrinking, or is it your share of the market is shrinking, or do you not know, or do you think about it in some other way when you look at it?
That's a great question. I think the market is growing. There's an increase in population in this area. So it's a regional thing. There's, more people coming here all the time, but people aren't coming to us. They clearly want this kind of service, but they're not coming to us. So maybe it's how we're delivering what we offer.
Now I'm curious. I don't really know your business all that well. So this is me just trying to get a little bit of lay of the land, but that would make me think that either there's a finite set of competitors and you have competitors that are growing while you're shrinking, or there could be a lot more competitors coming into the market. And while the pie is growing, everyone is getting a smaller share. Again, I'll ask, do you have a sense, or do you not really think about it that way?
I don't really think about it that way. By the way, I'm just playing a role here. This is not the way I would normally talk with people. But I'm just going to be like, no, I don't really think about it that way.
I was going to say, okay, now here's the question he should have asked.
Yeah, Val.
No.
What question would you throw in there, Val, to kind of crack this thing open?
Well, one of the things that we heard you say is that you think it's about the delivery. And I really like that. I would love to frame that out as a hypothesis of something that we could explore going forward, especially since you think that is potentially one of the key points of friction in why your revenue targets aren't being met. And so that's me role playing, but like finding a way to use some of the language to tease that out, because that becomes activity. So that becomes part of the work that we would do. But it's really funny how those just kind of like naturally bubble up. But I think as soon as Tim asks a couple of those questions, the natural pivot is to then say the second of the two magic questions, which is how will you know if you've achieved that? So it's probably more than just the number on your P&L that's going to help you know if you're on the right track to meeting that goal over the course of the year. What are some of the other ways that you might be able to know, especially as like an early indicator that that's what's happening? So maybe it would be something about competitive intelligence, since we were diving into understanding the competitive landscape, or understanding or de-risking some big decisions relative to launches to try to overcome some of those challenges. But it's not asking the 5 whys, because like that's just so off-putting, but it's really kind of putting in context what is being experienced and how is that helping shape the way we think about the outcomes that the business is trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. So you're trying to close the gaps bit by bit with each question to kind of say, okay, this is the direction we need to go. I think I know now why I love the game 20 Questions so much. I played it when I was a kid with my family on like road trips. We would play 20 questions. And I think that has somehow spilled over into my professional life because I love asking questions.
It is rare for somebody who we're working with who is like hurting on sales. They've spent cycles already trying to figure out what's going on. And that could be in a million different ways. So, I mean, it's tough to drop into a role play without having kind of your defined specific example. But I mean, and I wind up coaching analysts on this a lot. Like, they're like, well, I don't want to ask a question I'm going to look dumb, or maybe I should already know that. And it's like, yeah, you shouldn't walk in with a client not having done a Google search, poked around their website. You should come in with some questions that you're curious because you've never worked with home healthcare. And you know what? Say, I've poked around and tried to understand, but does it work like this? I mean, I worked with a philanthropic foundation once, which I would have assumed that there's a fundraising arm and there's a spending money arm. Every nonprofit I've worked with has had that. And it was midway through our first day with them that I've discovered that they had no fundraising. They were so well endowed that they said, if somebody dropped a dump truck full of cash at our front door, we would literally just leave it sitting there. But that came from me being comfortable saying, well, okay, but where do the funds come from? Like, people like to talk about their roles, their companies, what they're doing, and giving them the space to do that. A former coworker of ours named John Lovett, I mean, he hammered into me the first time I worked with him. He was like, you do not want to do a stakeholder interview where you are talking half the time. He's like, you want to talk as little as possible. I'm like, yeah, but I got to fill the space. And I watch people, I got to show up with my deck and my questions and run through the questions. Like, no, you need to show up and be curious. And you need to walk away with a much deeper understanding of the environment that they're living in, which will include what's keeping them up at night, what they've tried, what ideas they have that they can't validate, whether it's real or not. But if it was, it'd be, really cool. So
one of the things that I love about that is like, it's a way of eliciting the same information as if you had asked, what are your goals? What are your KPIs, which is the metrics and the targets, but you're meeting them where they're at with their language, with the things that they're comfortable talking about. Like you said, Tim, like people like talking about like the things that they've learned and like the institutional knowledge and the constraints and pressures in which they have to operate. And like, that's all super informative for an analyst to know so that we can figure out what are the best ways that we can bring data to the most important priorities of the business to help action and decisions. That's where you get to the meaningful work, not sketching out dashboards, trigger word for Tim, but making sure that it's connected. So it's like, how can we ask it another way that makes it really accessible and doesn't make them feel like they're on the hot seat? Like if you said, like Tim called out earlier, like what are all the metrics that you look at? Now you're putting pressure on someone to speak in data language, right? And they're thinking like, oh, what are all the metrics that I currently look at? Like, I hope I don't leave one off the list, because it's not their primary area where they play in a lot of cases, especially for some of those stakeholder interviews.
They've been told they have to be data driven, so they will just start barfing stuff out in a weird way. Like, I don't want this consultant to think that I'm dumb. I'm like, that is so wrong. There's no consultant who walks in on day one with a client that understands the business more than anybody who's been there more than 2 weeks, understands the business. So,
well, I love this idea of essentially reframing the questions to be in their language, right? So you can go in, what are your goals? What are your metrics? That's the way we talk about it. But I'm going to talk about it in the language that you use when you're getting ready for a board meeting, right? What's keeping you up at night before this board meeting? Well, I got to show this, this, and this. Okay. What about that is making you nervous? Why do you feel like da 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 da, right? So being able to help somebody let their guard down because you're speaking in their language, I think is really powerful. And I think too, what you were saying, Tim, is that this idea of active listening, really actively listening for those.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Nicely played. Nicely played. And that's one of the things I often talk about with students, or really with anybody who will listen, is when you're doing research, you're looking for an unexpected moment, an aha moment, or something that gives you a breadcrumb to follow. It's not the insight per se, but it's something you didn't expect. Is there anything that you guys can think of where you were in a focus group or you were looking at data and it just made you say, well, this is not what I was expecting to see?
Can I pander?
And now it makes me want to ask this question. Yes.
You just said something that, I mean, to me, when having read your book a month or so ago, and the fact that you said looking for a nugget, an aha moment that's not an insight. And I've been bothered by the overuse of the word insights for years, and various riffs and rants about it. You actually wrote a book where like the first half of it is talking about like what this is. But as an analyst, the number of times I've been told, like, we got you a login to their Adobe Analytics and we told them that you'd like poke around and you would like find some insights, which so wrong on so many fronts, but regularly. And even I think a lot of analysts will think that that's what they're doing, is if you slice the data enough ways, an insight will emerge. And I may start using it. It's like, no, that's surprising. That's an aha. But the fact that when you define that, it kind of definitionally, an insight has to have some level of triangulation of, there is some data, qualitative, quantitative, some combination. There is some creativity and some thought. The very fact that an insight is something that you can't just say, I found this little thing, the trumpets are playing, the angels are singing. You actually then need to sort of sell the insight, because to have something really bubble up to that level, definitionally, or your definition, which I kind of love, is that it is surprising. There are multiple avenues leading to it. Sorry, that's me just like pandering to you, but I was so excited when I was like, that's it. It's not that you're finding an insight. It's that you found something that is rich and meaningful and useful. And it's not just this singular, look at this one chart and now everything makes sense and everybody's singing Kumbaya.
Well, first, I'm glad that the book served as a form of therapy. I'm glad. That makes me happy. The second thing is, building on that, I do think of insights as being multidimensional, but I think that people are so pressed for time that when they find one nugget, they're like, that's it, go, run, off to the presses, right? And you can make great creative with a single data point. Like, you can take something and run with it and do something great. However, will it give you a really long-term advantage? Not necessarily. Whereas a multidimensional insight where it's plugging into this part of your business and this part of your business, and it's functioning at this multidimensional level, it's going to have profound ripple effects in your organization. That to me is why, like a true insight is bigger than one thing. But there's something in the language of it. When we say an insight, it automatically reduces it linguistically to a single thing. So we look for one data point. We look for one word, and those can make a difference, but it's about the articulation.
But that's the other thing, saying that, like, it doesn't mean you can't find the one little thing and act on it. And it can add value in the near term and the long term. It's just, I love the way you're framing it. Like, if you then slap the insight label on it, then it gives you permission to stop and run with it. And you may actually get some value out of it, but there may also be some missed opportunity to keep bringing in those other dimensions and say, is this giving us something that is truly a deeper understanding of our market, our customers, our competitors, something that would actually give us something that would sustain for a longer period of time?
Absolutely.
And what I was going to say is, I don't disagree with anything either of you have just said, but I do think that it is rarer for projects or research or evidence gathering activities to kick off intending to find something surprising, because it's actually really inconvenient when you find something that's a big surprise, right? Like you said, profound ripple effect throughout the organization. That's really hard to deal with. Like, that could mean the teams need to be restructured, or there's like completely different focus that you don't have any assets for. And maybe you have a 6-month cycle for all those approvals. And now you have to upheave everything you've already done, right? Like by the time you're doing research, there's been some investment in hopefully this idea holds water, or hopefully we'll find that there's something here that we can like run with. So I think it's great when organizations and brands can find something that's like a dislocation so they can connect with an audience, better than their competitors, or find an extension that no one's been able to go after yet. But just to say that like sometimes it is really hard for organizations to kind of deal with some of that. And so I think it's not always the intention is like, oh boy, like there's going to be.
But the ask is, you're just giving me information. I need you to give me insights, because the ask is we're expecting to find insights. But what we expect that to be is a simple, clear, we don't have to do anything disruptive to the business. We can just shift our creative, or shift this tactic, or shift this thing that is very, very low cost and has outsized returns. That's what there's this weird ask for. Give me the insights. And it's just not realistic. Like it just doesn't happen anywhere at the scale that somehow the overuse of that word and I will blame a lot of the technology vendors and kind of data heads pretend that that's what's plug into our system and these insights will emerge. And they're just kind of these shallow, empty calories things that are found.
Yeah. I mean, I think information plus interpretation equals insights. That may be an oversimplification, but you've often talked about, it's like, you have to do something with it. You can't just, here's the information like a dead bird that my cat just brought in. No, you have to do something to kind of bring it back to life and make it be seen in a different way.
And the interpretation isn't throwing that to the analyst to say, you do the if I don't see anything in it that's useful, like where does the interpretation fall? And I think there's more value when the interpretation is a partnership amongst the creative, not design creative, but just the creative thought within the organization to kind of hash through it. Because analysts, they're conditioned to say, do the thing, finish it, throw it over the wall, and the business will find an insight in it because they're the business. And it needs to be much, much more collaborative. I had this little aha, this surprised me. I can't rationalize it. Can we have a conversation? Can you rationalize it? What's going on here? Let's have some ideas. Let's dig further into those ideas. Like, an easier way to get multidimensional is to have multiple brains kind of thinking about it. If it's thrown over to the role of the insights team to just emerge with insights, like it just doesn't happen. And it's an abdication of responsibility by the entire organization, because everyone's kind of expecting somebody else to have some magic machine that spits these things out.
Mm-hmm. Val, you worked on Time Warner and had an interesting, surprising discovery or an aha moment during that project. Can you tell us more about that?
So we were working inside of the CMO's office, and this is in the mid 2010s too. I feel like I'm calling upon a lot of those examples because I can say the name and give you more detail about the story. But this is like to take your brain back to those times. That's when all your cable providers were pushing you into like the single, double, triple play, like the cable, internet, home phone. This is before people were like cord cutting and just moving to their mobile phone. So this is way back when. So there was all this research being done trying to figure out like what's the right mix of channels, or what are the right price points and discounts that we can do, introductory offers, because there was finally like Fios and Uverse that were coming in that were like actual competitors, because we know about all the monopolies of the telecoms in the early aughts, right? So they were trying to figure out like, how do we actually create loyalty? And there was so many different bodies of research that were done to kind of explore this. And it kind of all came to a head. It was like culminating in this like big drivers analysis to understand what is like the single most important factor in loyalty. Do you guys have any guesses what it was?
I can't think back that far.
That's fair. These stories, like I'll never forget some of these, just sitting in the room, walking our client through this, because it was really inconvenient for their marketing organization to hear that if someone had a problem with their cable, internet, home phone, and they made a call to the call center, that their problem was resolved on that first call. Or if a technician had to come to the home to fix the problem, because remember back in the day when those like installations, that it was solved in the first visit. that was more indicative of loyalty, even more so than someone who never had a problem. And so that was really inconvenient because it wasn't something that the marketing office had control over. Those weren't the levers they had to pull. It wasn't about messaging or creative or channel mix or promotions, whatever it was. How do we better train our call centers and our technicians to resolve issues quicker, to make sure that the parts are on the truck, to make sure that the call center can transfer to whoever needs to happen on that first call. So anyways, that was really surprising, but very inconvenient for that organization to grapple with because it wasn't a lever that they were currently holding on to.
Right. Those were like dark ages back then. So that's probably why I can't remember what it was like.
But it's an indication of, I mean, it is a case where like the right thing might have been for marketing to like give up 10% of their budget to redirect it to training in the call center, which just businesses they can't work that way. And that bothers my purist self to say, wow, but what if marketing brought that? They can't bring it in a way that's pointing a finger. Marketing would have the opportunity to go in and kind of market it a little bit and sell it. If we say our first time call resolution is lower than our competitors, there's marketing opportunities to feed it back.
So this is a really interesting thing, and I want to get to the speed round, but one quick note is that, you're going and you're digging around and you're finding some information, you get an aha moment, and there are these silos though between marketing and the operations and the customer service. And it's like, if we go out and find this information, we want you to leverage it as much as possible. And a lot of times the client, maybe not everywhere, but in my experience, a lot of clients will say, oh, we just thought you were going to give us new words or new images. Like we wanted that to be the fix for the marketing. And you're like, but the data's pointing, or the information we have is pointing to this over here. We could, like you said, Tim, fix your call center situation and have this be the data point that we then surface in the marketing, because that's going to actually impact people's behavior. So how do you break down those silos? What magic wand do you guys wave to get the clients to be like, you're right?
I mean, I think part of it is there's a tendency for people to make assumptions that they understand how things work in those other groups, because they've been tasked with kind of their silo. I'm thinking of a pharma client we had where we were working mostly with the analytics team, and there was a separate commercial insights team. And so those were both kind of in the data realm, but like they just didn't talk to each other. They were both worried about stepping on each other's toes. They spent so much energy staying in their own lane and just leading down the path of saying, but wait a minute, what we're being asked to try to figure out is what physicians feel about vaccines in this group. We cannot look in the web analytics data and answer that question, but isn't that what, and they're like, yeah, that's what that group does. I'm like, can we just ask them? Like, can we just,
what if thought experiment?
And they're like, well, they're going to think we're more, it took over a year. And then it still wound up being kind of fits and starts with finding the pockets. But I think the same thing years ago when I managed a BI team and like the call center, and like, yeah, CSRs are kind of a different breed, but they are a wealth of information. And they were literally one floor away from us. And we're looking at all this data. And it's like, can we just go down and talk to some of the supervisors? Can we talk to somebody who's like a lead? We actually wound up hiring one of the CSR leads to come into our BI team. So there's a lot of just like asking the question and saying, I'm just curious. Like, don't you want to know? Like, I want to know, and I don't even work here.
So Tim, you're talking about a very revolutionary idea here, which is to talk to people. Am I understanding that right?
Key takeaways.
Yeah. But feeling that permission to say, I just want to find, the number of times I'm like, but who is the person? Can you give me a name? And then I send a note to that person. I think back to that pharma client was so many different places, and I'd finally get a name, and I'd have to go like LinkedIn snoop to figure out who they were and what they did and like how their webinar, and then because I just wanted to ask some basic questions. Pretty easy to, same thing we were talking about earlier, asking them to understand what they're doing and giving them my perspective of like, why am I calling you? Because I'm just trying to understand something, and I don't want to go make assumptions or call things out that are stupid or impractical. As an outside consultant, wound up with like relationships with people in random parts of the organization. And it was frankly really frustrating with those analysts because they internally didn't seem to want to establish those relationships, even though it was at the core of the way they were going to be able to deliver value to their brand partners.
It was traumatic. I have firsthand accounts. It was traumatic. Can attest. The only other thing I'd add on to that is a lot of times analysts have this urge to kind of like show all this work to like prove their case about why something should happen in another area. And they think that that's what's going to move the needle when it's actually the opposite. If you think about like what is a really concise, compelling story that you could tell to a leader that they can share in a meeting that you're never going to get invited to. Because if you're talking about making some of those shifts between like marketing and a call center, that's going to happen way above your pay grade. Those leadership meetings are potentially something that you don't even know when they happen, all right, when they exist. And so finding ways to kind of package that in a story, again, so that someone can tell it without having your slides or all the different graphs and charts and dashboards. That's a one way that you can kind of infiltrate and cut across some of those organizational silos because those have a lot of staying power.
All right. So we are at our speed round now. You're each going to get a chance to take a turn answering this, but it's like, boom, really fast answers, right? So Val, what was your favorite subject in school?
Geometry. And I even think about it to this day when I'm like playing Magnetiles with my daughter. So yeah, that had some staying power for me.
What did you love about geometry?
Oh my gosh. I should probably find a way to do this in my free time. Like people do like crosswords or Sudoku, like geometry proofs are just like how it comes to such a nice little conclusion, like wrapped up with a bow on top of it at the end. Loved that.
It's very satisfying because there is a right answer,
yes.
Right? There's a right answer.
So satisfying.
Well, except you've got proofs. Like if you're like, I did it. I've got the proof. It's 27 steps. And it's like, you should be able to do it in 6.
I remember when I was doing geometry, though, I was like, why do I have to prove this? Somebody else has already proved this. Can we move on to new knowledge? Tim, how about you? Your favorite subject in school?
Oh, I mean, mine feels kind of lame, but it was probably programming. Like it's kind of like why I like woodworking as well. Starting with nothing and coming up with envisioning what you want to have and having it come out. And programming, I think I always enjoyed that.
Those are 2 very nerd alert answers. So apologies there.
I could also talk about trigonometry and how I still use it and love it when I get to reuse it. So, but that doesn't help the case. Doesn't help the cause.
You do both sound like you have some background in analytics. It's strange. Tim, what's your favorite word in English or in any language?
So rendezvous, I think, because I was a big reader as a kid and I knew that I'd read rendezvous so many times that it took me a long time to realize that that was rendezvous. So that's just like stuck with me since my youth. But the last like 5 years or 5 years, probably counterfactual. I think I probably use that word more and like light up inside whenever I get to say it.
That's like a take a drink. When Tim says counterfactual, we have to take a drink.
And then we're
so
back.
He uses that a lot.
Is there a sensor on the bottom of that glass? Because we have skewed the data because people are getting hammered. You won't shut up.
And Val, how about you? Favorite word?
My favorite word in any language is, let's see if you know it, la estacionamiento.
A parking space or a parking lot?
Parking lot. I love, it's like so elaborate. It sounds like it could be like, it feels very like dramatic and it's like parking lot. So that's my favorite.
Nice. Now for both of you, starting back with Tim, most underrated skill when it comes to strategy or the work that you do?
I think it has something to do with creativity or thoughtfulness. We'll run into people wanting a data strategy and like 7 times out of 10, what they really want to do is think more creatively about their business, but somehow they started with a data strategy. I've questioned like, what do strategists do? And I'm like, well, the strategists who I've known who have been really good are very creative and thoughtful, and they're trying to kind of connect the dots. They're sitting back, and thinking a lot, and the having the willingness and patience and aptitude for doing that, I think is top of my list.
Yeah, it's invisible work. People think that just sitting there isn't work because you're just sitting there, but there's a lot going on, presumably, not always, but thinking is hard work. Val, how about for you?
So I'll say listening is the short answer for this one. And to elaborate on that one, I think I've especially come to this answer because of how many more junior consultants that I've had the opportunity to kind of coach and mentor over the years, where a lot of the hard skills of our job are kind of taught in these like perfect scenarios and ecosystems with these like perfect, beautiful, clean data sets. And then they try to take that to the context of a client. And there's like sometimes this urge to be judgmental about how come they're doing it this way? Or can you even believe like how stale this is or how broken that part is or whatever? And it's like, let's pause and listen, because I guarantee you we're going to learn a lot about why things are the way they are or why they've had to operate inside of these contexts. And really getting to the root cause of that is going to make your projects and programs so much more successful than if you just came in and said, here are the things that I think are wrong because it's not perfect or it's not the way that I was taught to do it. And just really listening to those stakeholders to really figure out why. And that's a big one.
Mm-hmm. So earlier we talked about asking, and now we're talking about listening. This is revolutionary stuff you guys are bringing, but it's amazing how many organizations don't do it.
Yeah.
Val, what's one of the most interesting jobs you had before you got into the work that you do now that has helped you do your job better?
I have had the pleasure of having so many random weird jobs. But one that I think actually does kind of help me in my day-to-day today, especially with like the packaging of results and the data storytelling, is I was a physical therapy technician. I was assisting for lots of different patients coming in with post surgeries for their knees or back pain, things like that. And when someone comes in with pain like that, they're at a time of need, and people from all walks of life have pain in their body, right? So you would have people coming in as like a CEO who was nearly tearing up because the massage therapist is breaking up scar tissue or something like that. And so being able to have a conversation with people from like all different walks of life and all different levels, I think just kind of helps me remind myself going into these big conversations where, you know, you're presenting in front of leadership, or, you know, there's a big meeting with someone who's like really tricky to negotiate with. And it's like, they're people at the end of the day, just like you and me, that have, you know, their own motivations and baggage they're bringing to this conversation. But just to think about people as people, I think can kind of take some of the pressure off of some of the difficult conversations that you have to have in order to be successful in your role. So
great experience. Tim, how about you?
Probably my first couple of jobs out of school, I was an architectural intern. That was kind of my undergrad degree, and I was kind of on the path to becoming an architect, which I would have been terrible at. But what architectural interns do is a lot of drawing of window details in AutoCAD. So really, really focusing on the details combined with working with the creatives at the architecture who and sort of watching how they thought about design. So it was skewing towards architectural design. And we were doing a lot of pretty boring buildings, but there were a few people who were brilliantly creative, and watching them kind of iterate through coming up with facades that they were looking to propose. And then knowing that, oh, what you're drawing on, you know, bumwad sketches is eventually I'm going to be drawing the details hardlined in AutoCAD. And then eventually I'm going to be able to go and watch that building go up. And just like having that understanding of process and the pieces, and I think largely the need to communicate clearly. And buildings also have a big thick book of tech specs of what the carpet and the tile and the paint is going to be. And that's kind of what led me into technical writing, but just the need to communicate clearly, because you're trying to take ideas and ultimately put them up in buildings that will stand for some sustained period of time and be functionally effective. I think I've taken that kind of through my whole career. I wasn't very good at it. I mean, I could draw details, but I was never going to be successful in architecture. But I kind of loved that was early in my career.
So you love the details.
The details and the transformation from idea through, you know, something actually making it out into the real world.
What's the most recent good book you've read? Tim, let's start with you.
When you say good and most recent, I have to say James by Percival Everett. It's kind of the story of Jim the slave, Huckleberry Finn told through the lens of Jim. And it was just brilliantly written, made great points, complimented Huckleberry Finn really, really well. So
You're the second person on this podcast to recommend that book. Dan Cohen also mentioned that book and said it was fantastic. Val, how about you? It doesn't have to be a book. It could be a movie. It could be a show. It could be a music video, whatever you want.
So I would say this one's super popular is Severance, which is a show that just had its second season on Apple TV. Excellent.
I could not get into that. Failed.
Oh,
really?
I loved it.
Yeah.
How could you not get hooked in? The show starts with somebody on a conference room table and doesn't know why they're there.
I suspect it'll be like The Bear, that I couldn't get into The Bear, and then I came back a year later and just hoovered it up. So I feel like Severance is one of those where my second run at it, I may be it's so uncomfortable. Maybe the same thing with The Bear. I'm so uncomfortable here.
Well, Val, I know you mentioned in another conversation that you have a toddler at home. And so if you're looking for a great book that's not a business book, may I recommend P is for Pteranodon.
Oh, okay. I'll look into that one.
It's a fun book about silent letters.
Oh, fun. That's cool.
Better than Frog and Toad.
Well,
my daughter's obsessed with Frog and Toad.
It's a good compliment to Frog and Toad, but yeah, it's hard to top that bar. All right, last question. What is a piece of advice that you got early on in your life or in your career that you still remember to this day, or that you think of often? Tim, let's start with you, and Val, let's finish with you.
So mine, interestingly, the same guy, when I say, what are you trying to achieve and how would you know if you achieved it, was a guy named Matt Cohen, who we were doing some training together when we worked together in an agency. I picked that up from him. But the other thing that at one point, and I remember being kind of in his face, we were uncomfortably close, and I was wound up about I'm sure it was a hair care Facebook page data. And I was going off, and he was like, Tim, it's important to care. It's also important to not care too much. And that was probably 12 or 13 years ago. And to this day, probably twice a year, I will wind up just texting him hey, when I'm trying to get a little bit of perspective on what the hell am I so worked up about. And I'll just text. That's my outlet. I'll text him and I'll say, hey, Matt, it's important to care. It's also important not to care too much. And he wasn't trying to give me grand wisdom. He was just dude, chill out. And it stuck with me.
I feel you. I don't
follow it very well. It's advice that I don't follow well, but I think it's useful because at least I have awareness.
There are times when I'm working on a project where I start to feel like the fate of the universe depends on getting this right. Yeah. And you're like, does it? It's herbal essence. What? Is that really? Val, how about you?
I've had amazing mentors throughout my career. So I think a lot about the coachable moments that I've had. But in terms of the words that I think about often, maybe we should send this episode to my therapist, but it's the words that didn't feel good at the time that I've used to kind of fuel how I think about work in the world today. One of them was I had just been promoted to a senior manager and I was reporting into a vice president. And so just how the org structure came to be. So all of my peers were directors and senior directors. So there was a major dislocation. And the only, I'm using air quotes here, negative piece of feedback that I got in my annual review, it was you got 5s across the board. You're doing great. But then he dropped on me, but I oftentimes forget how young you are until I see some of the choices of what you wear to work. Because I was always rocking the blazer and Chuck Taylors at the time, if I recall correctly. But I think about that a lot, about the success in spite of yourself and letting that not deter me from wearing pink blazers on stage, which is one of my common moves, as Tim's nodding his head.
Her go-to move when visiting clients or on stage at conferences, she has a wardrobe of pink. I have pictures. When it comes to day to day, you were happy to see her on her one day of the month that she is not wearing a black shirt. She is Steve Jobs when it comes to being in the office.
Very interesting. So you use some of the comments that have been maybe hard to hear at first to fuel you in your pursuit of excellence.
I would say, maybe not excellence, my approach to bringing my whole self to work and making sure that what I do with my clients brings a lot of impact, we'll call it.
It's weird. She mutters suck it, Leon, right before she walks on the stage in her pink pantsuit, it's fueled her forward.
I love it. Well, thank you guys so much.
This was fun.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks again to our guests, Tim Wilson and Valerie Kroll from Facts and Feelings. If you want to connect with Tim and Val, you can find them on LinkedIn. Or check out their podcast, The Analytics Power Hour, where they dive headfirst into all kinds of data conundrums and counterintuitive findings. If you're looking for even more ideas and aha moments, head over to chriskochek.com. There you can find some of my newest online courses, case studies, and creative exercises for building insights and breakthrough ideas. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe to the Lightbulb newsletter. Every Thursday, I share 3 aha moments that are guaranteed to inspire your next project, creative briefing, or campaign. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast platform and share it with friends, family, clients, colleagues, even your enemies. Special thanks to Michael Osborne at 14th Street Studios for producing this episode, and thank you to Megan Palmer for additional editing and production support. Until next time, keep looking for patterns, finding contradictions, and asking what if more often.